I beg your pardon is one of those phrases that have two opposed meanings. In the first sense, it's a way of saying sorry. I beg your pardon, I didn't quite catch that. In the other sense, it's a way of being critical and disapproving. I beg your pardon, young man, don't talk to me like that. Many of us have heard it used the second way. We might even have said it like this ourselves. Either way, it's one of those phrases that slips out without our thinking about it. It's worth a moment's thought though. When we use it in the first way, to say sorry, we are actually asking for forgiveness. We acknowledge that we've done something to wrong someone, and we don't just ask them, we beg them to forgive us or pardon us. At the beginning of this week's Gospel, Peter looks at this from the other direction. Not the wronger, but the one who is wronged. How often should I forgive? He asked Jesus. As many as 7 times? 7 times is not enough, says Jesus. 77 is more like it. As so often, Jesus uses exaggeration for a deliberate effect. Just as in the parable that follows this exchange, he makes the sums of money equal to about £1 billion in today's money. Why does Jesus place such an emphasis then on the necessity of forgiveness? And why isn't once or even 7 times enough? Last week, we saw that a loving community is one that listens to each other, even when it's hard to do so. Disagreements and conflicts are inevitable, but the church can show what a loving and healed community is like by the way it handles arguments. This week's reading points us to how the loving community of the church should model reconciliation. And the headline news is, it's hard work. In the parable Jesus tells, the slave begs the king to be patient and give him time to repay his debt, an astronomical debt. But the king goes further. He forgives him the whole sum. But then the slave does a very human thing. Instead of being just as generous to his fellow slave, he refuses to forgive his debt and has him thrown into prison. When the king hears about this, the consequences are dreadful. I think this has 2 things to say to us. The first is that forgiveness is hard. The slave was probably terrified to go and see the king about his debt. It's really hard to ask for forgiveness, to face up to something that you've done wrong, and to admit it, and say that you're sorry, and to ask for forgiveness. How many times in our lives have we got ourselves into a corner because we can't admit that we're in the wrong? Several times a year, I make a sacramental confession, and to tell you the truth, I never look forward to it. It's really hard to bring my own wrongdoing to light and to put it into words. I beg your pardon, maybe a glib phrase, but sometimes it's not at all easy to do. On the other hand, it was probably very tempting for the slave to try and get his own money back, and he couldn't resist the temptation to punish the man who'd wronged him. If begging pardon is hard, forgiving a wrong done to us is even harder. How can we truly forgive something that has hurt us or someone we love? How can we forgive the pain that wrongdoing causes, the devastation and violence in our lives? As we know only too well, even small things can hurt terribly for years and years. One thing is for certain. Whatever else it means, forgiveness does not change the wrong thing. It does not make it magically vanish. It does not mean that we are not hurt or wounded. It does not make a dead person alive. It does not make what happened okay. Forgiveness doesn't mean that the person who did the wrong thing isn't responsible and accountable for it. And forgiveness isn't something we can just do like that. We can't simply say, "I forgive you," and move on. Forgiveness can take years. Often we have to forgive again and again, as many as 77 times, because it's a process, not a clean-cut action. Forgiveness can only come from a place of dignity. Forgiveness is a gift, but a costly one. Forgiveness, though, changes things. It doesn't change the past, that's impossible, but it can change the future. It can unchain us from the thing that has hurt us, in the sense that it gradually loses power over us. The wrong thing that was done to me isn't the sum total of who I am. And it allows the other person to change too, not because they didn't do the wrong thing, but because the wrong thing isn't the sum total of who they will be and what they will do. So that's the first thing. The second is that Jesus' parable starts, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to the king." The extraordinary generosity and mercy that the king shows in the parable is the mercy and generosity of the kingdom of heaven. In fact, the generosity and mercy of God. It's not the case that the wrong things we do, from terrible crimes to small acts of unkindness, don't matter to God. They do, because justice is central to God's kingdom. It's not the case that God's forgiveness erases the past. We have done what we have done, and we must bear responsibility for it. It's not the case that it's easy for God to forgive. His forgiveness was dearly bought by Jesus' passion and death. But it is true that God's forgiveness, his unending and unconditional forgiveness, founded in his extraordinary, extravagant, unending love for us, sets us free to become citizens of heaven. That is what reconciliation means. That God brings us back to the place where we can start anew in his loving and merciful grace. It's because we come to know this as Christians that we have a special responsibility to practice forgiveness and reconciliation. Reconciliation is coming home to the place where we begin, God's love for us. Reconciliation maybe is indeed hard and costly work. but it is out of such work that the kingdom of heaven is built. Amen.